Hi, I'm Arnie Skelton, and each week in this podcast series I'm going to offer you my top 10 tips on particular topics or themes that might be of interest to you as a teacher or manager or both. Hi, and welcome to this week's top 10 tips, which are on icebreakers. As a teacher for 11 years, I would have to use icebreakers to bring a group together that didn't know each other, often at the start of a term. And over the years, I've collected quite a few icebreakers, and I thought this week I would offer you my top 10 icebreakers. So if you're a teacher or trainer who needs to bring a group together that don't know each other and to get them working together, then these are my top 10 that I've used over the years. So tip number 1 is Dingbats. Dingbats refers to a particular puzzle, which is usually word-based. It can involve images, but it's often words. And they all represent a well-known phrase or saying or location, something that should be familiar to most people. And the idea is you try and work out from the combination of words and images what that particular phrase or saying is. Now, this is quite good either as an individual activity or for teams, for groups who try and work things out for themselves. So if you had, let me think of one. My favourite probably is the word Golden Gate with a horizontal line underneath it, and then underneath the horizontal line, the letters from the alphabet H-I-J-K-L-M-N-O. So it's got Golden Gate with a horizontal line underneath it, and then underneath that the letters from the alphabet printed H-I-J-K-L-M-N-O. And the answer to that is water under the bridge. Golden Gate is a bridge in San Francisco, and the letters H-I-J-K-L-M-N-O run from the letter H to O. So under the bridge is the chemical formula for water, H2O. So Golden Gate, horizontal line, letters H-I-J-K-L-M-N-O. The answer is water under the bridge. So that's Dingbats. You could look them up on Google, and there's a whole stack of them available, and it's really quite an entertaining and fun way to bring groups together. Tip number 2 is 5 in common. Probably my favourite, the one that's easiest and simplest to run. And you put people together into groups of, say, 4 or 5 people, and you ask them to identify 5 things that they all have in common, those 4 or 5 people. And you insist that they don't choose something very ordinary and obvious, like we're all in the room together, or all human beings, or we're all on the same course. You give them credit for coming up with something a little more interesting and different. So typically if you want to give them some hints, favourite food, places they may have been, favourite colour, and so on. And they try and work out 5 things they have in common. And then when the time is up, you ask each group to tell you what those 5 things are. It's fun, it's non-threatening, it's fairly straightforward. So that's tip number 2, 5 things in common. Tip number 3 is I went to market. You may know this nursery rhyme from early years, where you would say, I went to market and bought 6 eggs. Then the next person has to repeat that. I went to market and bought 6 eggs, and then add something, such as, a comb. And the next person says, I went to market and bought 6 eggs and a comb and a highlighter pen. And then the next person has to say, I went to market and bought 6 eggs and a comb and a highlighter pen and a can of pop, and so on. So it's a game where everyone has to repeat what's been already said, only you don't do random objects. You do something that's useful for the course. So a useful way is to say, I went to market and my name is Alan. And the next person says, I went to market his name is Alan, my name is Betty. The next person says, his name is Alan, her name is Betty, and my name is David. So that's a very straightforward, easy one. So to add value, you can say, my name is Alan, and I enjoy going to the cinema. So you ask them to add their name and one thing or something about them. So the next person says, this is Alan, and he enjoys going to the cinema. My name is Cheryl, and I like reading books. So the next person says, and this is Alan, he likes going to the cinema. This is Cheryl, she likes reading books, and so on. So it's a kind of I went to market, and you don't have to use the phrase I went to market. You start with whatever you like, and it's a great way of getting people to introduce themselves and also embedding people's names because it's repetitive. So that's tip number 2. Tip number 3, I went to market. Tip number 4, 2 true, 1 false. I really enjoy this one. Everyone has got to come up with 3 things about themselves, 2 of which are true and 1 of which is completely false. So when I usually give an example of this, I will say, I've run the London Marathon, I've knocked Prince Charles off his bike, and I once danced on stage with Michael Jackson. Now, 2 of those are true and 1 of them is false. And so people can, on their own, try and work out which is the false one, or you can ask them to do it in pairs or small groups. Now, in that particular case, the false answer is being on stage dancing with Michael Jackson. But I have actually knocked Prince Charles off his bike, and I have actually run the London Marathon. So it's not only a fun game, but you actually learn something about each individual who takes part. And that's really quite useful if afterwards people are talking and mingling and chatting, and that's a starting point for a conversation. Crikey, I never knew you ran what was the London Marathon like? Blah, blah, blah. So that's number 4. 2 true, 1 false. Tip number 5 is called Who's. WHO''S. And you create let's say a 16 box grid, so a 4x4 matrix. So 16 boxes. And the heading above all the boxes is Who's. And you put into each box who's travelled furthest from this college, who's been furthest from this college, who's got an unusual collection, who's met somebody famous, who's won anything significant, who's got a pet, who's got the most brothers or sisters, and so on. So you create 16 of these who's got or done something interesting. And you give the sheet to a group, and they go through asking the 16 questions, who's this, who's that, who's the other. And sometimes the question is who is the most, so there's only one winner. And sometimes the question is who's got, like a pet, and maybe there might be 4 or 5 people in the group who can answer that question, that they have a pet. So again, it's a nice little exercise to get people talking and finding out about each other. So that's tip number 5, who's. Tip number 6 is discovery. And the idea is to get people to introduce themselves to each other. But rather than doing it in that fairly staid and false way, you give everybody a question. And it's a separate question. Now you can do this randomly, get them to draw their question out of a hat, or you could just give them out. So one person's question might be, what's your favourite place? Somebody else might have their question as, who would they most like to meet and why? Another person in the group could be given the question, what's the scariest thing you've ever done? And so on. So everybody gets a different question, and the idea is they have to just chat to other people in the room by asking them their question. So let's suppose you've got a class of, 20 people. Each of those 20 has their own specific question, and they just spend 10 minutes, asking as many people in the room as they can their particular question, and they make a note of the answer and the person's name. Then, when the 10 or 15 minutes is up, you get the group together and you choose someone's name and ask them to report back on the answers they got to their question. So the person who, let's say it was Eric, asked as many people as possible what the scariest thing was they'd done. So Eric reports back on, let's say, 4 people who he asked that question to, and he will say, well, Jennifer's scariest thing was whatever, and that Richard's scariest thing was whatever. And it's quite nice because it gets people talking, but they're talking about somebody else, and they're talking from notes they've taken. So it's a quite nice way of getting people talking and chatting about other people, not about themselves. So instead of what is often quite pressured of asking somebody to introduce themselves and what's the scariest thing that they've done, this one gets them talking about somebody else and the scariest thing that they've done. And people are more relaxed about doing that than talking about themselves. So that's tip number 6, discovery, where each person in the group is given their own particular question and gets to discover answers to that question from other people in the group. Tip number 7 is line up. And this is particularly useful for people who've been sat too long or just don't like sitting, who like moving. And you ask everyone to stand up, and you find some space in the classroom, usually alongside one of the walls, so it can be in the middle of the room or at the front of the room. And you ask everyone to line up in order of, and then you have a number of different orders. So you could say, line up in order of height. So let's suppose you've got 12 people in the group, and they just have to sort themselves out. And so they line themselves up in order of height, tallest at one end, shortest at the other. And then they can line up in order of the alphabet of their first names. So anyone whose name begins with an A is at one end, and anybody whose name begins with, well, whatever, at the other end, X, Y, Z. Then you ask them to line up in terms of how far they live away from college. And what this does is force them to speak, or at least look at each other, and get themselves organised. So it's a little bit of a team exercise, because the easy one is to say line up in order of alphabet of your first name. People will say, well, what's your name? Well, I'm called Moira. Okay, M. No, I'm Nigel. Okay, well, you need to stand next to Nigel, Moira. Okay, and it also just tells you who in the group probably is quite good at organising others. So that's line up. Get people to line up according to a number of criteria. Tip number 8 is object and date, and this is a PowerPoint, so it's quite nice. There's a lot of PowerPoint options here, and this is one of my favourites. So what I've done is I've taken from the internet photos of familiar objects, and then my PowerPoint presentation is to put that object on the screen and ask everyone to guess the date when that was introduced, when that was the year in which it was introduced or became available. So you can have anything. I've got one of those space hopper things that people bounce up and down on. There's a Rubik's Cube. There's an Apple Mac or an iPhone. There's a Citroen 2CV car, something fairly iconic, maybe Concorde, just something that most people will know or have a sense of seeing before, and then they have to guess the date in which it was introduced or made available. A Coca-Cola bottle is quite good. Just 10 or 15 objects, and the idea is they all have to guess the date. So that's tip number 8, object and date. Tip number 9 is perhaps my favourite, which is Pictionary Relay. You may know the game Pictionary, where someone has to draw the word. You can't use any text on the drawing. You just have to draw what the word says. So it could be tiger, and someone has to try and draw a tiger, and everybody else in the group has to guess it. So that's the essence of it. But my version is slightly different. You make it competitive, so there's more than one team, ideally, and they love this. And then you, the teacher, has a set of words. And the set of words, it could be tiger, it could be a tree, it could be something more challenging like scorpion, or castle. And they have to draw that, and somebody in the team guesses the answer. Now, it's called Pictionary Relay because in the team everyone has a number, because they're going to act as a relay. And person number 1 comes to you and gets the first word. They take it back to their team and draw the word. Whoever guesses correctly, they are not the person who goes out to get the next word. It's number 2 in the relay. And this is to prevent the same people just being good at guessing words. So this gives everybody a chance to get a word and draw. So let's suppose there are 5 people in the team. They're numbered 1 to 5. First person gets the word, let's say it's tiger. They successfully draw tiger. Person number 4 guesses tiger, but it's person number 2 who goes out to get the next word. This means everybody in the team gets the opportunity to do the drawing. I've played this a lot, and they absolutely love it because it's energized, it's active, it's people are standing up, people are yelling out words, and also yelling out words quietly, because they don't want the other team to hear it. And you run this for maybe 6 or 7 words, and then there's a winner, the one who gets the end of the list of words first. Pictionary Relay. Great. And finally, tip number 10 is I'm just going to call it audio-visual. There's any number of icebreakers you could use, especially using PowerPoint, where you use a visual to get people to say what they see, or to find the answers. So, for instance, I do a find the band visual, where I've put up about 30 pictures of objects that are the names of bands. So, for example, a cup of chocolate steaming is hot chocolate. A lot of creepy crawly insects, people will say the Beatles. Maybe I've got a picture of a couple of eagles, and they're reasonably well-known pop groups, so that's Find the Band. It's pictures on the screen. And audio, I often do music. Can you guess the song title and the artist? It's kind of quiz, but there can be an audio quiz or there can be a visual quiz. So tip number 10 is just be completely open to the idea that you can set up all sorts of quizzes that are both audio or visual or both. So that's tip number 10. Think of audio-visual quizzes for your icebreakers. And that's it. So just to quickly run through them again. Tip number 1, Dingbats. Tip number 2, 5 in common. Tip number 3, I went to market. Tip number 4, 2 true, 1 false. Tip number 5, whose. Tip number 6, discovery. Tip number 7, lineup. Tip number 8, object and date. Tip number 9, Pictionary Relay. And tip number 10, audio-visual. So that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. Hope you found that useful. Bye for now. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, make sure you subscribe. You will still get the podcast for free, but you will also get an alert to let you know when the next podcast is available. And please recommend the podcast to anyone else you think might like it and benefit from it. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a review and any other comment, because they'll help promote the podcast series on the relevant platform. So, bye for now.